In this video, I want to highlight some of the key passages and events of Pride and Prejudice from pages 44 through 86. And in particular, I want to focus on Mr. Wickham, especially Mr. Collins, the Netherfield ball, and Mr. Collins' proposal. So Mr. Wickham is a handsome young officer who's new to the neighborhood, and Elizabeth takes quite a liking to him. This is part of the Jane Austen romance plot. The first part is the main character sort of sorting through all the potential mates that she could end up with. She's already kind of had a little love-hate thing with Mr. Darcy. Mr. Wickham is in the picture. Mr. Collins is in the picture. These are all possibilities. But the one she likes best in her first impression is Mr. Wickham. In fact, that was the original name or title Austen had for Pride and Prejudice, was First Impressions. That was the original title of the novel. And because she likes Mr. Wickham a lot and doesn't like Mr. Darcy, she's very interested in the story Mr. Wickham has to tell about how Mr. Darcy supposedly reneged on his, old Mr. Darcy's, promise to give Mr. Wickham this church job, and now Mr. Wickham has to go in the military. We'll have to see later on whether she should have believed that, but she certainly does. She has a prejudice for him and against Mr. Darcy. Later on, Elizabeth gets some more information about Mr. Darcy from Caroline Bingley, who is, of course, a friend of Mr. Darcy and does not like Mr. Wickham. And she gives this sort of long account of Mr. Wickham in which she says, well, he's only the son of the late Mr. Darcy's steward, who would be a servant, an upper-level servant, but still a servant. And she says that Mr. Wickham behaved in a most infamous manner towards Mr. Darcy. And then her final comment on that is, considering his descent, one could not expect much better. So Caroline is invoking that norm of class we talked about, where someone's class and moral character were thought to be connected. Caroline certainly agrees with that, right? She's saying, well, considering that Mr. Wickham is descended from a lower class man, you could not expect him to behave better. It's interesting to note, however, that Elizabeth doesn't seem to agree with that. She sort of rebuffs Caroline and makes it clear that she doesn't buy into that logic. All right, but the real star of the reading here is Mr. Collins, right? He is the cousin that will inherit Longbourn, the Bennet estate, when Mr. Bennet dies. And he's come to visit the Bennets for the first time. They've never seen him before. And the narration tells us that he plans to marry one of the daughters because he thinks this will atone for the fact that I'm going to inherit their estate. His plan is, okay, I'm a pastor, I need a wife, my boss, Lady Catherine, wants me to get married, so I'll just marry one of the Bennet girls, and that'll sort of help their financial situation, because if Mr. Collins married one of them, then he could take care of them, right? They could stay there even, perhaps. But there's one problem with that plan, and it's not the fact that he's a cousin. People married cousins back then. That would not be the issue. The problem is him, right? He's kind of a socially awkward guy with very low emotional intelligence. And I think Austen uses Mr. Collins as a way to sort of teach people, particularly young men, how not to behave. He's almost a walking lesson on what not to do if you're a young guy trying to make friends and approach women. So, I mean, there's so many things I could cover, and they're so funny, but one is on page 49 where they're sitting down to dinner, and Mr. Collins is talking about how he likes to make up or give compliments to women. You know, he's talking about his boss, Lady Catherine, how he compliments her daughter. And Mr. Bennet immediately picks up on the fact that this guy is pretty awkward and doesn't realize what he's revealing. And Mr. Bennet says to Mr. Collins, "May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or the result of previous study. So in other words, he's asking, do you like make up these fake compliments? And Mr. Collins admits that he does. He doesn't even realize that he's admitting that. And it's in front of all these women too. So there, I think the lesson might be something about either be authentic or don't advertise the fact that you're not authentic, which is what he does. A little later on, the Netherfield ball is approaching, right? The Bennets get invited to that, and Mr. Collins is included. And he's one of those guys who just assumes that a woman's going to be interested in him if he approaches them, even if they haven't shown any interest or anything. And so, like, the minute that invitation comes through, he says to the Bennet daughters, I hope to be honored with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances. And of course, I think the lesson here would have to be something like, you can't just assume that every woman you want to approach is interested in you without there being some signal or some kind of relationship you've established. He just, he hardly knows them and he's approaching them. All right, well, next we get to the Netherfield ball, and there's a very funny moment with Mrs. Bennet, and then most of the rest are about Mr. Collins. So Mrs. Bennet is there, and I think she must have been drinking because she's one of these people who talks loud, at the ball, and they had punch there that had alcohol in it. So I suspect she's been drinking that, and she's talking, kind of bragging about the fact that Jane and Bingley are dating because he's a rich guy and she wants her daughter to marry a rich man. And she says loudly so the whole room can hear, including Mr. Bingley, there will be a great marriage, and that will throw the girls into the paths of other rich men. Well, that is a horrible faux pas for, just imagine if you were dating a guy and your mother was loudly talking about how great it is because he's rich and hopefully that will bring money into the family or help your sisters marry rich men, just no discretion there at all. No, there's a lot of lack of self-awareness and lack of audience for both Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Collins here. Well, one of the things that Mr. Collins does that's a real socially awkward thing is he creeps up on people. He's one of these people, I think people call this being a creeper. I don't know. Anyway, he will just sort of come up to people even when they're talking to someone else and just kind of like get really close to them and just insert himself into their space. Like on page 69, Charlotte and Elizabeth are talking privately, and Mr. Collins just comes right up to them and says, that he came up to them and told her with great exultation that he had just been fortunate as to make a most important discovery. Like he just interrupts to announce himself. And he does this to Mr. Darcy. He's like, oh, I realize that my boss, Lady Catherine, is, Mr. Darcy's aunt. So he hasn't even been introduced to Mr. Darcy. And he just goes up to him and starts talking and saying, oh, this and that. And, Mr. Darcy just walks off. Back then you didn't talk to somebody if you weren't introduced, especially if they were higher in class. But I think even now that's a little weird to come up to people like that. So I think the lesson here would be something like, you don't just kind of insert yourself into someone else's conversation or begin talking to them without some kind of introduction or some kind of, knowledge of the person, right? But Mr. Collins does that. Well, later, Mr. Collins, he's the kind of guy who has, I think, what we would call today main character syndrome, if you know that phrase. He just always is drawing attention to himself. Like, people are playing music and they're kind of between people who are playing the piano, and he just starts giving a speech to the whole room. He says on page 73, If I were so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the company with an air, for I consider music as a very innocent diversion and perfectly compatible with the profession of a clergyman. I mean, he's just starting giving this long speech, like no one's invited him to speak. He just starts doing that. So, you can't just assume everybody is interested in you, and that you need to be the center of attention all of the time. The last little thing I'll talk about with the Netherfield ball is Mr. Collins kind of clinging on to Elizabeth. I mean, she's danced with him 2 dances, right? I think she's trying to be nice. She agreed to do that. But then she's made it clear she doesn't want to dance with him anymore. She doesn't like him. So she's politely declined. But he won't take no for an answer. And so on page 74, it says, she, Elizabeth, was tested by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side. He assured her that his chief object was by delicate attentions to recommend himself to her, and that he should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. I mean, imagine how well you would like this if you were at a party or a dance and there was someone there who you weren't interested in, but that person kept just staying right by you and just saying, "Oh, I want to, recommend myself to you," or what, he the lesson here is you gotta learn to take no for an answer or something. You can't just be around someone all the time and assume that's going to make them like you. In fact, that's going to backfire, if anything else. All right, so I think this is a good place to pause the video here, and we'll come back in the next video and talk about the marriage proposal, which is quite a scene.